Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we are exploring an entity that was, well, not merely a corporation, and it was really an economic empire that fundamentally rewrote the rules of global trade, finance, and conflict.
We are diving into the Verenigde Oostendisch Company, the VOC.
Right, the Dutch East India Company.
And for almost 2 centuries, from 1602 right up to 1799, the VOC was easily the wealthiest private enterprise the world had ever seen.
We've been really digging into the archives, looking at the details of its astonishing rise, its pretty revolutionary financial structure, and also the corruption and external shocks that eventually brought it down.
Yeah, our mission today is really to show you how this trading company kind of morphed into this quasi-sovereign global power, and importantly, what lessons its history might hold for the huge multinational corporations we see today.
Okay, let's unpack this straight away, because the scale of its power, it's often just drastically understated, isn't it? When we think of a modern company, we think legal limits, national boundaries, shareholders. But the VOC was something, well, much, much more shocking, operating right at that intersection of commerce and statecraft.
What's really fascinating, I think, is the sheer scope of authority the Dutch States General granted it. That initial 21-year monopoly charter. It was just an unprecedented delegation of state power to a private entity.
So it wasn't just allowed to trade.
No, far beyond that. It had the specific enshrined authority to wage war, to maintain its own standing armies, to negotiate and sign treaties with foreign powers, basically establishing its own foreign policy in Asia.
Wow. And not only that, but they could actually govern the territories they captured.
Yes, exactly. They could imprison, try, and execute convicts. And they were literally authorized to strike their own coins, complete with that VOC monogram.
So this wasn't commerce backed by the state.
Not at all. This was commerce acting as the state, certainly in the Eastern Hemisphere. It's the ultimate example, really, of commerce fused with state power.
And the numbers just underscore the staggering scale. Between 1602 and 1796, the sources confirm the VRC sent nearly 1 million Europeans to work in the Asia trade.
On 4,785 ships. Think about that number for a second. Nearly 1 million people moving halfway across the world, all for this single company.
It's incredible, and if you need a comparison just to grasp the dominance, you just look at its nearest and, well, later its fiercest rival, the English East India Company, the EIC.
Right, and the difference is stark. Over the same 2 centuries, the EIC sent roughly half the number of ships, about 2,690, and they carried significantly less tonnage of goods, too.
So statistically, the VOC just completely eclipsed all its European rivals in the Asian trade, certainly for most of the 17th century.
Its infrastructure, its capital, its military reach, they were simply unparalleled at the time.
Okay, so how did a trading venture in the relatively new Dutch Republic manage to raise the capital and structure itself to achieve this monumental advantage? Let's dive into that. Section 1. The genesis of modern finance and corporate structure.
Yeah, and this is where the story gets incredibly relevant to modern economics, actually.
Yeah.
The VOC wasn't just created out of thin air, right? It was born in 1602 from the, let's say, forced consolidation of several smaller competing Dutch entities. These were known as Voorkompagnieën, or pre-companies.
And the driving force behind pulling them all together was Johan van Oldenbarneveld, the Republic's leading statesman at the time.
Exactly. He saw this chaotic, fragmented market where Dutch merchants were constantly undercutting each other, and that weakened their ability to compete against the established Portuguese monopoly.
So his vision was for a unified, centralized operation, a monopoly that could pool resources, reduce risk, and, crucially, exert military force when needed.
Precisely. But the real innovation wasn't just the monopoly itself. It was the financial mechanism used to fund it. This basically invented the modern concept of the joint stock company.
I think we sometimes forget just how revolutionary that model was back then. Before the VOC, most big trade ventures were financed voyage by voyage, weren't they?
That's right. Investors would put up money for a single trip, and the capital would be distributed, when the ship hopefully returned.
Which created huge instability and risk if a ship sank.
The whole venture could just dissolve.
Yeah.
The VOC changed this completely by establishing permanent capital. This capital, initially totaling 6,424,588 guilders, which was an astronomical sum, 10 times the EIC's initial capital.
Wow.
This was invested not in a single voyage, but in the company's entire lifespan.
Okay, but hold on. If the capital was permanent, meaning investors couldn't just get it back until the whole company eventually liquidated, How did everyday people manage their risk? They couldn't just wait 200 years for a payout, surely.
Well, that structural constraint, the permanence of the capital, it actually forced the creation of a solution,
Yeah.
the secondary market.
Okay.
Because investors couldn't cash out directly from the company, they had to sell their shares to other interested parties. These sales happened in open-air markets, and one of those, famously, grew into the Amsterdam Stock Exchange.
Right. So this liquidity, this ability for ordinary Dutch citizens to buy, sell, trade shares freely, that was the birthplace of modern securities trading.
Exactly. And it allowed the VOC to raise absolutely massive amounts of capital from a really wide base of investors, not just the super wealthy elite.
And that risk management, it extended right up the corporate ladder too, didn't it? Which is where we see the concept of limited liability being applied in a really groundbreaking way.
Yeah, when you look at the organizational structure, it was complex but very tightly controlled. You had the 6 chambers, the kamers, in different Dutch port cities like Amsterdam, Middelburg. But all the real power rested with the board of directors.
Yeah.
They hear in the 7th, the Lord 17.
The Lord 17. And Amsterdam held the majority voice there, right? 8 out of 17 seats. I remember seeing notes in the sources about how the Zealand delegates weren't too happy about that.
No, they chafed at Amsterdam's dominance, feeling it dictated trade policy. But politically, they didn't have much choice but to accept it.
And critically, this limited liability, it applied not just to the general investors, the participant,
But also to the managing directors themselves, the Bewinhebbers. And this was really rare at the time. Their personal wealth was protected from the company's debts. Their liability was limited just to the capital they'd paid in.
which must have encouraged them to take bigger risks on behalf of the company, knowing their personal estates were safe if things went belly up.
Absolutely. It offered managers significant protection.
And the initial shareholders, they were surprisingly diverse for the era, weren't they? It wasn't just Amsterdam bankers.
No, not at all. We see 301 early shareholders coming from the southern Netherlands, modern Belgium. Many were merchants displaced by the ongoing religious and military conflicts. Isaac Lemaire, who we'll talk about again later, was one of them. He was the largest single subscriber, putting in a massive 85,000.
And finally, we can't overlook the effort they put into their visual identity. That famous VOC monogram, the big V with the O and C on either side.
It was everywhere, on flags, cannons, buildings, coins. The sources point out how effective it was. Simple, symmetrical, versatile. You could argue it was the world's first globally recognized corporate logo. It really cemented the company's presence across continents long before anyone even talked about corporate identity.
So that incredible structure and that massive war chest really set the stage for Section 2. Building the monopoly and the Cohen strategy. The initial motivation for all this effort was pretty straightforward, right? Control the spice trade and cut out the Portuguese.
Yes, exactly. The Dutch Republic was deep in that long conflict with the Iberian Union, Spain, and Portugal. So cutting out their middlemen wasn't just economic, it was a geopolitical imperative. Plus, the European market had this just insatiable appetite, especially for pepper.
And the early successes were phenomenal. Huge risks, but the rewards.
Absolutely justified it in their eyes. Expeditions like Jacob Van Nex in 1598 made a 400% profit return. Astronomical.
But those huge returns quickly focused the VOC's primary ambition, achieving a total enforceable monopoly.
Yeah, their core goal became cornering the Moluccan spice trade, specifically nutmeg, mace, and cloves. These things were like gold dust back then.
And the profits they could make were just staggering.
Unbelievable. The VOC set up a system where it could sell these spices in Europe and even in sophisticated Asian markets like Mogul, India, for 14 to 17 times the price it paid to the local producers back in Indonesia.
Okay, but here's where the dark heart of the monopoly really shows itself. That astounding profit margin came at a brutal cost locally.
It absolutely did.
Yeah.
Because the VOC was the sole buyer, a monopoly buyer or monopsony. It wielded absolute power over pricing. It just drove down the prices paid to local producers in the Spice Islands to ridiculously low levels. It effectively destroyed the indigenous economies, their self-sufficiency,
And if the islanders dared to sell to anyone else?
or even just tried to maintain their own subsistence farming, the VOC would resort to tactics like burning spice trees to artificially cut supply and force compliance. It was ruthless.
But even with these huge spice profits, the VOC faced a critical systemic flaw. And this was identified by the man who'd become the architect of its power structure in Asia, Governor General Jan Pieter Zoon Cohen, appointed in 1619.
Right. The problem was the precious metal drain. Europe just didn't have much that Asia wanted to buy. But Asia, especially powerful empires like Mughal India and King China, They wanted silver and gold.
So to keep the spice trade going, Europeans were constantly forced to ship out their own precious metals.
Which was unsustainable. It was damaging European economies.
So, given the incredible spice profits, why was Cohen's solution this complex intra-Asiatic trade system? Why was it so necessary? Why not just keep pouring European gold into Asia?
Well, Cohen understood something crucial. A state-level power, which the VOC aimed to be, couldn't rely on an external currency system that just drained its home base. The intra-Asiatic trade system was, frankly, ingenious because it made the VOC financially self-sufficient within Asia itself.
It transformed the VOC from just a buyer and seller
Into an internal Asian trader. It was a massive strategic shift.
Okay, so tell us exactly how that mechanism worked, because it really powered the VOC for decades.
Okay, so it started with VOC ships bringing basic supplies from the Netherlands to Asia. But the real engine was using regional goods and currencies. The VOC cultivated relationships with the Japanese shogunate, managing to secure Japanese silver and copper.
Metals highly desired elsewhere in Asia.
Exactly. Highly desired in places like India and China. So the VOC used this Japanese silver to trade with empires in Mughal India and Qing China for high-demand goods like silk, porcelain, and, crucially, high-quality textiles and cotton.
And these Indian textiles, which the VOC got much cheaper using Japanese silver rather than European gold, those were what the local populations in the Spice Islands actually wanted in exchange for their nutmeg and cloves.
Correct. The textiles basically became the internal currency. They could be traded within Asia for the coveted spices, or they could be shipped directly back to Europe for profit.
So this system drastically reduced the need for European precious metal exports. It stabilized the VOC's finances and, I suppose, freed up capital for projecting military power.
Precisely. Cohen understood that for this system, for the VOC to succeed, it needed a secure, permanent center of operations in Asia. And he showed his ruthlessness in 1619. He stormed the port city of Jakarta.
And from the destruction, established the VOC headquarters, renaming it Batavia, which is, of course, modern-day Jakarta.
Yep. And this consolidation naturally led to inevitable conflict, military and diplomatic conflict, mainly with the English East India Company.
And this rivalry culminated in that notorious event in 1623, the Amboina Massacre.
It really was a pivotal moment in Anglo-Dutch relations. VOC officials arrested, tortured, and then executed 10 Englishmen, along with several Japanese and Portuguese auxiliaries. The charge was conspiracy.
And the impact.
Well, the sources make it clear. While it caused a massive diplomatic firestorm back in Europe, the practical effect in Asia was that the English, quietly but pretty decisively, pulled back from most of their Indonesian activities.
Which left the VOC with a clear path to consolidate its regional dominance and really enforce that total spice monopoly.
And their expansion just kept going. They conquered Gali in Ceylon, modern Sri Lanka, from the Portuguese in 1640. That secured them a massive cinnamon monopoly.
Then they systematically took over the Malabar coast, pushing the Portuguese out of India's west coast.
And we mustn't forget their critical resupply outpost down in southern Africa. In 1652, Jan van Riebeck established the post at the Cape of Storms, which became Cape Town.
Initially just a logistical move, right? A pit stop.
Strictly logistical at first. A vital rest stop for ships traveling between East Asia and the Netherlands needed for water, fresh food, repairs. But even this simple outpost showed their commercial power. If non-company ships tried to use the station, they were charged exorbitantly.
Okay, so by 1669, the VOC had truly reached its absolute peak. Let's move to Section 3 now. Reorientation, financial stress, and the slow decline. Because even a company that was effectively a state couldn't maintain that kind of growth forever.
No, but by the 1660s, it was a behemoth. We're talking over 150 merchant ships, 40 warships employing 50,000 people, and maintaining a private army of 10,000 soldiers and shareholders. They were getting massive dividend payments, 40% on their original investment.
Incredible. But right around 1670, the sources show that amazing growth starts to stall. There was this double crisis. What hit them first?
The first crisis was really the internal collapse of the engine room, that intra-Asiatic trade system. The Japanese connection was the absolute linchpin.
Right.
When the VOC lost its Formosa outpost in 1662, and then the Japanese shogunate severely restricted the export of silver and gold, mostly due to their own internal currency concerns, well, the supply of that cheap, desirable metal just dried up.
So by 1685,
Japan basically ceased to be that easy source of finance, and that crippled the VOC's ability to trade freely and self-sufficiently within Asia.
which meant they had to go back to relying on European bullion, the very thing Cohen had so brilliantly avoided. Okay, and the second crisis was accelerated global competition.
Indeed. The Third Anglo-Dutch War caused trade interruptions, which led to a temporary price spike in pepper. The EIC, always kind of hovering nearby, seized this opportunity. They aggressively entered the market with massive volumes.
Initiating a fierce price war.
Exactly. Now, the VOC's superior capital allowed it to outlast the EIC in that specific war. The EIC share price even briefly crashed, but it signaled a permanent shift. The era of total unchallenged monopoly was definitively over.
So recognizing this new competitive reality, the VOC made a critical strategic pivot. They shifted away from those high-profit, high-risk spices that defined their early success,
And moved towards volume over margin.
meaning focusing on lower margin but high-volume commodities, like tea, coffee, textiles, sugar.
Precisely. And this shift was fueled by two main factors. First, changing consumer tastes in Europe. There was now this revolutionary demand for massive quantities of these new goods. And second, there was abundant, cheap European capital available now to fund the necessary fleet and infrastructure expansion.
And this transition period, roughly the 1680s to the 1720s, that's what historians call the era of profitless growth. They were getting bigger, but the returns weren't keeping pace.
The expansion was huge. They doubled the fleet, doubled the overall size of the company. But look at the numbers. The tonnage of returning ships rose by a staggering 125% during this period.
Yeah.
Yet total revenues only rose by 78%. They were essentially running faster just to stand still financially.
And the profitability metrics you mentioned are quite shocking.
Yeah, they're a clear indicator of market saturation and competition. Average annual profit actually fell only slightly, from about 2.1 million down to 2.0 million guilders. But profit as a percentage of total revenue, that dropped from a healthy 18% down to just 10%.
Wow.
And the annual return on invested capital fell too, from around 6% to a worrying 3.4%. They were forced to compete in these new globalized markets where demand for things like tea was elastic and the supply wasn't so easily monopolized. It just led to severely thinner margins.
And compounding these financial stresses were military setbacks, signaling a loss of political control, too. The sources really highlight the pivotal 1741 Battle of Colachel.
Oh yes, that was a catastrophic loss for the VOC. It was fought against the Indian Kingdom of Travancore under Raja Martanda Varma. The Dutch military detachment was decisively defeated.
And the significance.
Well, the sources cite it as one of the earliest clear examples of an organized Asian power successfully defeating and capturing a European army. They used effective counter-strategies and military discipline. This defeat effectively ended the VOC's ambitions on the Malabar coast and forced a retreat, basically yielding influence there to the English.
Okay, so by the 1730s through the 1780s, the company is really in its final decay. The sources list 5 major factors that sort of collectively fed into this slow, systemic demise.
Yeah, we can tick them off.
Yeah.
The first two are kind of external and structural. First, the continued erosion of that intra-Asiatic trade, which forced retreats from key trading hubs like Persia, Surat, and Bengal.
And second,
The very centralized logistics system they'd created in Batavia actually became a massive inefficiency.
why did Batavia become such a bottleneck? How did that happen?
Well, the VOC was built around this centralized hub-and-spoke model. Every Asian commodity had to pass through Batavia for inspection, taxation, repacking before being routed to Europe.
Okay.
By the 18th century, competitors like the EIC were shipping high-volume goods, especially tea, directly from China to Europe. They completely bypassed Batavia.
Making them faster and cheaper.
Exactly. The VOC's required handling time, and its rigid sailing routes made them slower and less reactive to the fast-changing European demand trends.
Okay. Factor 3, and maybe the most corrosive internally, widespread corruption, or private account trading.
Oh, this was venality on a truly crippling scale. Employees, often poorly paid relative to the immense risks they took, just began trading for personal profit, using company infrastructure and resources, all to the detriment of the company itself.
And the most egregious example the sources cite is the Amphion Society.
Right. Tell us about that, because it speaks volumes about the internal rot.
Well, the Amphion Society was basically a group of high-ranking VOC employees who managed to secure a de facto monopoly on the opium trade on Java for their own benefit.
The conflict of interest is just stunning.
Mm-hmm.
At the very time the VOC itself was struggling for cash, being forced to pay monopoly prices to the English East India Company for opium from Bengal to supply its Asian markets.
Its own managers had created this profitable private enterprise that undercut the company, made the need for expensive EIC imports even worse, and just lined their own pockets.
Yeah, that level of financial malfeasance was just impossible to sustain long term.
Okay, the fourth factor brings us back to the enormous human cost of this whole enterprise.
The high mortality and morbidity rates among employees were just devastating. The sources estimate the VOC consumed, that's the word they use, approximately 4,000 people per year.
4,000 a year?
Yeah. Of the nearly 1 million seamen and craftsmen who left Holland between 1602 and 1795, only about 340,000 ever returned.
Good heavens.
Which meant the company was constantly recruiting, constantly transporting personnel just to maintain its operations. It was a constant, expensive, and frankly horrific drain on resources.
And finally, the fifth factor was pure financial mismanagement, driven partly by a political need to keep investors happy, an unsustainable dividend policy.
Right. The directors faced immense pressure to maintain the company's reputation and, crucially, its share price. So after 1730, when profitability really plummeted, the directors just refused to significantly lower the dividends.
So they were paying out more than they were earning.
Consistently. Distributed dividends consistently exceeded actual earnings year after year, which rapidly drained the company's capital stock both in Asia and in Europe. They increasingly relied on short-term anticipatory loans, essentially borrowing massive sums against expected future revenues.
Making the company incredibly fragile and leveraged.
Extreme.
So the financial and operational rot was clearly setting in. But it's fascinating that even at the company's absolute beginning, long before this decline, investors were already fighting for better accountability. Let's move to Section 4, accountability, violence, and the final collapse.
Yeah, the VOC's investors were, in many ways, the first recorded examples we have of modern shareholder activism. Take Isaac Le Maire, largest initial shareholder and known as history's first recorded short seller.
He wasn't happy with how things were being run, even in the very first few years.
No, not at all. In 1609, he launched the first recorded expression of shareholder activism we know of, petitioning for the VOC's liquidation. He complained specifically about poor corporate governance. He charged that the board sought to, and I quote, retain another's money for longer or use it ways other than the latter wishes.
And his efforts actually led to the first restrictions on short selling.
Yes, established by the States General in 1610. It shows how disruptive he was to these nascent financial markets.
And his complaints kind of set the stage for a full-blown investor rebellion just over a decade later, right?
That's right. In 1622, we see history's first recorded shareholder revolt. Investors demanded a proper financial audit, a reckoning. They were profoundly distrustful of the management's secrecy and their accounting methods.
And that's where we get that amazing quote about corporate distrust, where they claim the company account books had been smeared with bacon so they might be eaten by dogs.
It really captures the contempt they felt for the managing directors.
Did the investors ever actually get the audit they demanded?
Well, the directors eventually relented slightly. They were forced to open some account books under scrutiny. But the overall resistance to full transparency, that remained a constant problem throughout the VOC's entire history.
It's a powerful testimony, though, isn't it? This early activism showing that tension between investor interests and opaque managerial control, a tension that still defines corporate governance today.
Absolutely.
However, while shareholders occasionally forced some accountability, the VOC was primarily accountable to its own profit motives, which leads us directly to the dark side, the systemic use of violence to enforce its monopoly.
Yeah, the sources make it crystal clear that violence wasn't just incidental. It was foundational to the business model. We have that infamous quote from Governor General Cohen himself back in 1614, justifying their methods. He said, "Your honors know by experience that trade in Asia must be driven and maintained under the protection and favor of your honors' own weapons, and that the weapons must be paid for by the profits from the trade, so that we cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade."
Wow. Cannot carry on trade without war, nor war without trade. That philosophy led directly to perhaps the most horrific atrocity associated with the VOC, the conquest of the Banda Islands.
This was a military operation undertaken explicitly, solely, to establish and enforce the nutmeg and mace monopoly. It happened between 1609 and 1621. The invasion, personally overseen by Cohen, was utterly devastating to the indigenous population.
The estimates are just shocking.
They suggest that 14,000 out of the 15,000 native inhabitants were killed, enslaved, or driven away. The conquest essentially depopulated the islands.
And when it was complete, only about 1,000 Bandanese survivors remained.
Yes, and they were forced into labor. The company then systematically imported enslaved people just to maintain the required labor force for the nutmeg plantations.
It was a highly organized system, wasn't it?
Oh, yes. The sources confirm the VOC established this system, importing roughly 200 slaves annually from various regions just to maintain a total slave population of about 4,000, purely for the nutmeg groves. The profitability of that monopoly was literally built on mass violence and chattel slavery.
And the violence wasn't limited just to the initial conquest of territory. It extended to maintaining order within their own colonial outposts. The 1740 Batavia Massacre is a stark example of that internal violence.
Yeah, this incident occurred after a severe downturn in Batavia's sugar economy. That led to high unemployment and unrest among the ethnic Chinese residents there.
And then rumors spread.
Rumors spread that the VOC was planning mass deportations. Unrest broke out, and the VOC troops, along with allied native militias, responded with just brutal ferocity, slaughtering and pillaging the Chinese community.
The death toll estimates are horrifying.
Scholarly estimates range from 5,000 to over 10,000 deaths. It was considered serious enough back in Amsterdam that the VOC board was forced to launch an official investigation, actually the first of its kind in the company's history, into the actions of its colonial administration.
The VOC also formalized the practice of slavery at the Cape Colony almost immediately after Jan van Riebeeck established that resupply outpost in 1652.
Yeah, the company quickly realized it needed forced labor to establish and maintain the outpost and the surrounding farms. Initial imports included slaves from Dahomey, modern Benin, and Angola.
But later sourcing became incredibly wide.
It did, drawing enslaved people from East Africa, Mozambique, Madagascar, Ceylon, and right across the vast Indonesian archipelago.
And the demographics there really show how critical this forced labor was to the outpost's survival.
Absolutely. The slave population grew dramatically, reaching nearly 16,839 by 1795. And the sources note this population was overwhelmingly male and actually exceeded the number of European settlers until the first quarter of the 19th century.
So what started as a simple supply stop quickly became a sophisticated slave-dependent agricultural hub, critical to the VOC's entire logistics chain.
That's right.
Ultimately, though, the slow internal decay, the financial strain from corruption, the unsustainable leveraging, it just couldn't withstand a catastrophic external shock. And that shock was the Fourth Anglo-Dutch War, 1780 to 1784.
Yeah, that war was the definitive, immediate cause of the VOC's collapse. British naval attacks, both in Europe and in Asia, just crippled the company's ability to transport goods. It cut the fleet in half.
And the financial losses.
Huge. 43 million guilders in direct losses. A massive blow to an already heavily leveraged operation. The combination of fleet destruction and loss of assets just reduced the company's net assets to absolutely zero.
They were bankrupt.
Completely. Despite some desperate attempts at reorganization by the Dutch provincial states, the company was just far beyond saving.
So the VOC's monopoly charter was allowed to expire.
And the company was formally dissolved, nationalized by the government of the Batavian Republic on the 31st of December, 1799. Ending the 200-year reign of the world's first multinational corporation.
So, in summary, when we look back at the VOC, we see this entity that really defied easy categorization, didn't it?
It really did. It was a hybrid, a unique mixture of a sovereign state, a major military power, and a revolutionary financial corporation. For 2 centuries, it was the principal engine driving globalized trade and, yes, colonialism.
And what really stands out as we wrap up this deep dive is that incredible, almost frightening paradox right at the heart of the Dutch East India Company.
Precisely. I mean, on one hand, the VOC pioneered and perfected so many essential tools of modern capitalism. The joint stock company, permanent capital, limited liability for managers, even corporate branding. They proved the capacity of private capital to organize global logistics on a scale nobody had ever imagined before.
But on the other hand,
they simultaneously pioneered the most brutal and systemic practices of colonialism, corporate violence, and exploitation on an equally massive scale. They were the ultimate demonstration, perhaps, of the terrifying power that can accrue to an entity motivated purely by profit and monopoly.
And here's where it gets really interesting, especially when we think about our modern world of data and massive organizations. The VOC's relentless bureaucracy, its complexity, driven by the sheer scale of its operations across continents. It generated an unbelievable volume of data about those operations.
25 million pages.
Ugh.
25 million pages of VOC records survive today. It's an unparalleled, deep data set detailing the political, economic, social, cultural conditions across vast stretches of Asia and Africa. And this massive archive was, quite rightly, added to the UNESCO Memory of the World Register back in 2003.
So what does all this mean for you, the listener? Well, consider this provocative thought. If the history of the VOC is preserved in 25 million pages of, let's face it, undeniable truth-detailing innovation right alongside atrocity, financial genius, alongside systemic corruption, what responsibility does a modern government or corporation bear for the history contained in the archives it inherits?
And maybe more relevantly for today, what are the globally operating corporations of our time documenting about their own operations right now, knowing that their records, their data will one day be the definitive, undeniable account of their own history for future generations to judge?